Good evening, and welcome to our first virtual open house on Facebook Live. I'm Mark Murphy, Senior Director of Capital Planning and Development at Lakeridge Health. Thank you for joining us. Tonight you will have an opportunity to learn more about the new long-term care home currently under construction beside the Ajax Pickering Hospital. You will hear from our construction and design team, who will momentarily walk you through the layout of the new home and highlight key design features. First, some housekeeping notes before we begin. Kind of stalled out here. The virtual open house is being recorded, so if you wish to watch again, you will be able to do so. We're looking for your thoughts and feedback, so please leave a comment. Any questions will be followed up, and the answers and the video of tonight's event will be shared on our website, www.lh.ca, in the coming days. Throughout the presentation, we will have a couple of poll questions, so please take a moment to respond to them. Your feedback and insight are a valuable part of the project's progression and success. In a moment, you will hear from Matt Gavin, Principal, G Architects, and Andre Boran, Construction Manager, PCL. Before I hand the presentation over to Matt Gavin, Principal at G Architects, I want to provide a short construction update. We are looking forward to beginning the construction on the home's parking garage and roadway works in the very near future. We need the parking garage to help meet the increased volume we anticipate in and around the Ajax Pickering Hospital once the long-term care home is built. To enable construction of the garage and the road network, we have identified the scope of work required, including trees that will be protected and preserved, and those which will need to be removed and become part of our replanting program after construction. The process was overseen by an arborist and in collaboration with the town of Ajax, and received the required approval permits for site work to construction to occur. As we move forward with the project, no further trees will be affected. Lakeridge Health has a long history of promoting environmental sustainability and energy efficiency across the system and will continue to advance that agenda. I would now like to introduce Matt Gavin, Principal, G Architects, who will provide the design update.
Thanks, Mark. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm very happy to be here to share some news about this very exciting project for the community of Ajax and the whole region of Durham. I'm sure anyone who has driven down Clements Road recently has noticed that there is a lot of activity happening on the site, and I'm sure there's a lot of curiosity about what is actually being built. In a few moments, my colleague Andre from PCL is going to be explaining what's happened so far, what's going to happen next, and exactly how PCL is building this building so quickly. But before that, I'm here to give an overview of the design of the project and explain some of the features that are in the home. This is a very exciting project, I think, for the town of Ajax and for the entire region, because we're not only bringing 320 new long-term care beds into the capacity for the community, but we're doing so at an unprecedented speed. But at the same time, we're delivering a state-of-the-art facility that is going to exceed the current design standards and incorporate many lessons learned from the global pandemic. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to try to highlight some of the infection prevention and control best practices that we've managed to integrate into the design of the new home. I'm going to start by sharing the site plan. Matt, if you can begin the presentation. Thank you. And the next slide. So I'm going to orient everyone first just to the site plan and where the new building is going to be located. This is a view as if we were flying over the site in a helicopter, which happens from time to time. And you can see that our building is located at the northwest corner, the southeast corner of the site, but the northwest corner of the intersection of Clements Road and Harwood. So Clements is just at the bottom of the page, and Harwood, you would imagine, just on the right-hand side. Access to the new building will be through the existing road network that's on the Lakeridge site, which would be coming in just at the top of the page. The peachy color shape just at the very top of the page, you see, that's the bottom edge of the new parking structure that Mark mentioned. So obviously a 320-bed home with all of its staff is going to add quite a bit of parking needs to the site. So part of the project is a new structured parking lot, which will be adding several hundred new spaces. But a visitor coming into the site would be coming in the road just that enters the top of the page, proceeding towards the top of the rectangle of our building. That's where there would be a covered drop-off. So someone dropping off a passenger will be able to pull over underneath a weather covering that would protect a passenger getting out of a car. That car can then proceed around the roundabout, either to some of those convenience barrier-free parking, or they proceed into the parking structure itself. On the west side of the site, that's really all, there's a few staff parking spots, but that's really a service area of the building. So that's where the garbage gets picked up. It's where the compactor is located. It's where trucks of supplies come in and there are deliveries to the building. And it's where things like the transformer and the generator are located. So it's really the back of the building. Though we are sensitive that is right on Clements Road, and all of that will be appropriately screened with fencing and landscaping, so it's not going to be too visible. Another thing to point out on the site, right near the front entrance, there's a few additional spots, and that is for they're dedicated for a dialysis clinic that is going to serve patients from the community, as well as ambulatory residents in the long-term care home. And I'll explain a little bit more about the dialysis when we actually start looking at the plans. So next slide, please, Mark. So this is just to give an overview of the size of the building. So it's a 6-story building, or will be when it's complete. The top 5 floors are almost identical. So levels 2 through 6 each have 64 long-term care residence rooms on them. So that's 64 times 5. That's our 320 long-term care residents. The only real difference between level 2 and the upper levels is that there is a roof terrace on level 2 in the form of an enclosed courtyard. And that's going to be a secure outdoor space for a specialized behavioral unit, which will be on the 2nd floor west side of the building. Otherwise, the floors are essentially the same all the way up, again, with the exception of that roof terrace. And on the ground floor, there's another enclosed courtyard. As you saw on the site plan, there's not a lot of real estate left on the site after we put our long-term care building on it. So we made this effort to create courtyard type spaces to create secure landscaped outdoor space for the residents. On the ground floor, as I mentioned, there are no long-term care bedrooms. The ground floor is all the spaces that the home needs to care for all of the residents. So the back of house and the facility management, the administrative type spaces, as well as residence amenities, and that 9-station dialysis unit that I mentioned. Next slide. So this is a blocking diagram of what's on the ground floor. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but the colors represent the different departments or types of spaces in the home. So the gray color is, as I mentioned, facility management spaces. So that's things like the boiler room, the garbage room. The pink and the green color are the laundry and the kitchen facilities. The orange color are the staff facilities, break rooms, locker rooms, and things like that. And the purple color is the dialysis clinic. And you can see that it is connected to the main entrance area. It has its own front door. The blue color are the administrative areas. And then the yellow color is the residence realm. That's the public realm, so where the residents will have access to. And I'm going to zoom in on that a little bit and speak a little bit about what kind of spaces are in the home for resident amenity. So next slide. This is one of the first diagrams that's going to start to unpack some of these ideas we have around infection prevention and control, best practices, and lessons learned from the pandemic. And one of the strongest things that we've done in terms of the ground floor is a really clear separation of both the front of house and the back of house spaces, and a really clear separation of traffic, service traffic, of both clean and soiled service traffic. So the yellow color, again, that's the resident world. That's the space that residents, members of the public, once they're appropriately through the door security of the front door, will all have access to. The gray color is a highlight of the staff-only service traffic that also exists. So there's really 2 worlds on this ground floor plan. The front of house world that is facing to the residents, and the back of house that is entirely staff-only. Within that staff-only circulation, we've got completely separate traffic routes for both clean and soiled flows. So for example, clean supplies come into the building through a separate entrance. So that would be things like food and medical supplies. They go down a dedicated clean route, down a clean corridor, to a clean elevator, and up to the floors. Meanwhile, soiled things, and particularly heavily soiled things like garbage and soiled laundry, come down chutes into soiled handling processing areas, proceed down soiled only corridors, and to the laundry or the waste handling areas. So avoiding any risk of overlap between soiled things and clean things, again, like food or fresh supplies coming into the building. That's one of the things that we've really tried to implement in terms of this infection prevention and control best practice. And this is certainly an enhancement against, say, the baseline design of a long-term care home. And next slide. So this is the public or the resident realm of the home. So now we've zoomed in a little bit on the yellow tone that we've looked at a couple of times, and there's a few labels on here to help understand the types of spaces. This public realm or the resident world on this ground floor really embodies in many ways the philosophy of the home, which is that it is a home to 320 people. And there aren't many spaces in your own home that you aren't allowed to go to. So there's a good deal of openness and access for residents and visitors and their family members in the home. The only spaces in the home that are kept separate from resident access are those that really are for their own safety, like staff areas, or for reasons of avoiding the crossover and potential cross-contamination, as I said, in the clean and soiled separation. Within that public realm, or the front of house of the building, as we sometimes like to call it, the residents have actually very good access, and that will hopefully promote activation and socialization and positive outcomes for the residents who are able to come down from the floors and enjoy this very generous and rich environment on the ground floor. So this is a slide I wish I had the power to gesture to during this talk, but I'll do my best to orient everyone to some of the spaces. So the main entrance is right underneath the word resident on this slide, under public resident realm of the title. So that's the main entrance, where we'll come into a generous area we call the gathering lounge. Adjacent that is the harvest room. That's, think like a party room or a celebration room. It's a space where you can have a more private gathering in a closing room off of that larger gathering lounge. Adjacent that, there is a small shop or gift shop, sometimes called a general store, where residents and family members and visitors could buy a few variety of items. Proceeding to the right-hand side of the page, if you were to go down the corridor from the gathering lounge, that's the main administration offices, and it connects to the dialysis entrance. So ambulatory long-term care residents who are going to receive dialysis treatment would proceed down that corridor, and that's how they access the dialysis clinic. The dialysis clinic also has its own vestibule for outpatients, for members of the community coming for dialysis. And there are security measures and a separate vestibule that are going to be able to make sure that members of the public can't go through the dialysis and into the long-term care home, which is another infection prevention and control measure we want to be monitoring. However, that corridor also gives access for residents and family members to key spaces like the administrator's office or the business office, if they're meeting, if they want to have a meeting with the administrator, or collect mail, pay their bills, that sort of thing. So that's all part of the resident world. Again, if you can go back to the gathering lounge area, if you were to not go down to the right to the administrative area, but to go down the middle of the page, that's the main common space of the home. The great room is the big yellow square in the middle. That's a big multi-purpose room or town square, quite a generous proportion for larger events or parties or celebrations, very flexible space. And you can see that it addresses that ground floor secure courtyard, and the two really face each other and create the social heart of the entire home. That landscape courtyard will have a number of elder-friendly features, including an accessible walking route, so a walking route that is a very level and flat, flush surface that won't create any kind of tripping hazards or create issues with gait. It will also have a mix of soft landscaping, things like a shade structure, seating areas. It will be able to be used by all the residents of the whole facility, as I mentioned. There are a lot of reasons why a courtyard is actually a great type of outdoor space for a long-term care environment. And two of them, I think the most significant, one, of course, is security. It creates a completely secure outdoor space for the residents to enjoy with no chance of someone eloping or having not being seen in the outdoor space. But it also creates a microclimate, which is a great thing for elders. It'll have a strong wind break, obviously, by the walls of the building will break the wind, and the walls of the building will create a lot of shade, which is actually another good thing for residents. Although we have been sensitive to make sure that the proportions of that courtyard are still going to feel like a positive outdoor space. It's not going to feel too skinny or tall. We've studied the proportions of the height of the building around those walls and the depth and the width of the courtyard, which is quite generous. As you can tell, it's about the same size as the great room. So the great room and the courtyard together will make, I think, a very positive social hub for the entire home. If we go back up to the gathering lounge, again, so if you proceed to the right side of the page to the administration or down the page to the main multi-purpose room and the courtyard, on the left-hand side in the resident realm, there are some more private type of resident activities that we don't really want necessarily on the main street. And that's things like the hair salon, wellness space, and some physiotherapy spaces. And those spaces are all located right at the elevator, which take you up to the resident floors. The next slide, please. So this is a diagram of the typical home areas, which are the floors level 2 through 6, as I mentioned. They're all essentially the same, except that, again, the level 2 is the unit that will have the behavioral unit and will have access to a roof terrace, much like the courtyard that is on the ground level. It also has all those features of a courtyard that I just mentioned, you know, the microclimate and the security, but it has the added benefit that the behavioral unit will be able to conduct outdoor programming in a completely safe and secure and also separate environment from the rest of the residents. So that's a really positive amenity for a behavioral care unit to have access to. But other than that second floor roof terrace access, all the home areas are on the floors are essentially the same. There's one resident home area on one side. A resident home area is a Ministry of Long-Term Care defined term. Sometimes they're called neighborhoods or households, but the 32-bed home area is meant to really be the home for those 32 residents. The trends in long-term care with considerations of resident acuity, cognitive ability, and mobility challenges means that a lot of a resident's daily life is spent in their home area, in their unit, just because traveling a lot of distances can be challenging. So we really try to make the home area have all the things that a resident needs for day-to-day life. So that means that every home area, so every grouping of 32 bedrooms, has its own dining spaces, living rooms, lounges, activity spaces, as well as all the spaces that the staff need to care for the residents. So things like a nurse's station, assisted bathing spaces, and medication rooms and supply rooms for all the supplies and personal protective equipment and things like that. All of that is contained within each home area. The two home areas on a floor, so again, 32 residents on each side, and then they share some things in the middle, which we call the node, and that's the orange color on this diagram. Next slide, please. So one of the great, I would say, design enhancements or post-pandemic thinking in this project is in the bedroom design. So this building has a much higher than average ratio of all private bedrooms versus two-person bedrooms. So 75% of all the bedrooms in this building are going to be completely private. And that means a bedroom area and a two-piece bathroom associated just with that bedroom. Some long-term care homes built could have 60% or even 50% of the rooms being private, with the rest being two-person rooms. And we have seen a lot of evidence that private rooms have, for obvious reasons, some superior performance in outbreak conditions. So right away, having 75% of the rooms being private is a substantial measure that we can take to improve the performance of this building in a future pandemic or outbreak situation. As for the 25% of the rooms that are two-person rooms, and two-person rooms are generally, they're provided for reasons of affordability, and there are two-person rooms in this design, but they aren't, they're what we would call semi-private rooms, not truly two-person rooms. So that means that each bedroom is essentially private. You have your own door into your bedroom area, but the semi-private bedrooms, which are the ones colored in this diagram in the light blue color, the bathrooms have two doors into them, sort of like a university dormitory kind of arrangement. But the sleeping room is completely private and separate. And I would say that has infection prevention and control merit to it, but it also has a lot to do with resident dignity and privacy, and can also result in better outcomes for the residents. There's good evidence that shows that there's certainly improved sleep behaviors in private and semi-private bedrooms, like we're showing, and that improved sleep that has positive impacts for residents in many categories. Another unique feature of this home that not many long-term care homes in Ontario have are dedicated rooms for bariatric residents. And bariatric is the clinical term for very large people. So there are 2 bariatric suites per floor, and those are in the royal blue color, the medium blue tone in the diagram. And those have several features to accommodate larger people, including more space in the room just for maneuvering of very large mobility devices, and things like the lifts in the ceiling and grab bars or other fixtures are rated to support greater weight. Next slide. Another key post-pandemic lesson learned that's being implemented in this project is this concept of clusters within the home area. So each floor, as I mentioned, has 2 32-bed home areas, and they will operate as such most of the time. But they also have there's sort of a second mode of operating, an outbreak mode, or there could be other reasons to operate the mode in this way, because subdividing the 32-bed home into 2 16-bed clusters has, again, positive outcomes for outbreak management, infection prevention, and control management, but it also helps to create more intimate and home-like and residential scaled spaces. You can imagine a dining room size for 32 people is not always very home-like or intimate, but what we have in this design with this cluster concept, the dining rooms are actually sized for 16 people. Again, doing double duty. It has infection prevention and control merit, but it also is a more intimate and home-like environment. So each home area of 32 beds is further divided again into 2 clusters of 16 beds each. Each cluster has its own dining room, its own lounge, its own sunroom, and its own clean and soiled handling areas. And so that's going to really help if the home were in a future outbreak or future pandemic. This would really allow the staff to keep the residents in each cluster separate from each other and avoid any potential cross-contamination between the 2 sides. So it's really just a tool we're giving the staff in their toolbox, another way that the physical environment can actually support operations if there were a future outbreak. In the white area on this slide, I'll just explain what is shared between the 2 home areas and the clusters. That's in the middle of the spine between the yellow areas in white. That is a staff-only zone. That has the food preparation spaces, kitchen and dishwashing areas, staff washrooms, storage rooms, mechanical and electrical service rooms, and it's also the location of the linen and garbage chute rooms. So that is entirely a staff-only space. But around the elevator lobby, there is another little cluster of public spaces on every floor. And this is another post-pandemic lesson learned. And that was around the challenge of family visits during an outbreak. There's been a lot of discussion in the long-term care industry around this topic in terms of how family access, both for visiting and also acknowledging that so many families are also caregivers. How do we maintain family access in a home while managing everyone's risk? So there's actually a dedicated space on each floor in the elevator lobby that's called the Harvest Lounge, and that's going to be a family visiting space. So that in a future outbreak conditions, if the home areas themselves are secured from outside visitor access to keep everyone safe, there will still be a space just outside the elevator lobby, just outside the door of the home area, where family visiting or family caregiving could be facilitated. Next slide, please. So I want to review some of the long-term care design principles that are in this plan. I've talked a lot about infection prevention and control, and of course that's very front of mind for everyone these days during the pandemic and looking on the horizon for the future. But I've also mentioned how some of the design measures are specifically about that, but they also do double duty and try and also be thinking about things like smaller, more residential scaled and familiar spaces, improving residents' sleep, looking for generally positive outcomes. And that is really the core of it, is resident-centered design. And that's a personal passion of mine. And it's something that we've really managed to work hard to implement even within this very fast-paced project. So resident-centered design, I mean, it means being focused on evidence and outcome-based thinking. So those are some of those things I was speaking about. Looking at studies about sleep patterns and how resident sleep impacts overall wellness and improves outcomes. So that's the kind of research that goes into the design. Resident-centered design also means being very staff supportive, because we know that staff morale and quality and level of happiness, level of satisfaction in their work, that impacts the residents that they care for. So we've made sure that this space also takes into consideration the challenges that the staff have to manage while working in a building like this. We're also sensitive to the fact that the staff spend a lot of time inside this building. So we make sure that we're considering their needs, and there are specific measures in this building to support staff and also to keep them healthy and safe. One of the innovations of this project is that there are multiple and separate staff locker and change facilities that will support a flow of a change from when you enter the facility in your street clothes, that you can change, shower, get into your work uniform, do your work, come back, change out of those clothes, shower, and then move back into the street clothes side. So that's an effort to manage, of course, keep everyone safe. It's intended to create protocols that will prevent the staff from bringing a virus into the home. But it's also about making sure that there's protocols in place that are going to keep the staff that work in a home like this healthy through potentially future outbreaks, or there are many things that the staff don't want to bring home with them outside of the facility. So there's a lot of that kind of thinking has gone into this design as well. We also think always about the residents' privacy and dignity. One of our core values at G Architects is to always ask ourselves, could we live in this home? Could you live here? Is an honest question that an architect needs to ask themselves when they're working in a place which will be the last home that many of the residents will know. And part of that is looking at making sure we have good access to daylight and view, and specifically from different orientations and at different places. And that's because, again, this is all connected together as part of being that outcomes-based thinking. When you spend all of your time inside of a building, it can affect your natural rhythms, your circadian rhythms, your sense of when it's time to go to sleep. So we make sure that we always have windows on multiple sides of the building, so that residents who may actually spend a lot of their time within their resident home area can still get a sense of how the daylight changes over the course of a day and changes over seasons. And you can see that in this diagram that's showing where the little areas where daylight and view, where light is coming into the building. We've got lights and windows at the end of every corridor. The lounges have multiple views. We have some views into the courtyard, out of the courtyard. We really try to do everything we can to maximize daylight. And finally, thinking about keeping people active and motivated to walk and also support some residents who may have wandering behaviors. When the two clusters are open, there's a great opportunity around that courtyard for perambulation, or kind of walking all the way around and socializing between the two sides. In that outbreak mode where doors get shut between the two 16-bed clusters, we wanted to make sure we were thinking through that situation as well, and not creating dead ends where someone is trying to go for a walk, is just going to hit the end of a corridor and need to turn around. And that's what's reflected in the dashed circles on the plan. That shows where we've widened the corridor at the ends of the two clusters to allow someone to have a little bit of space to turn around. And at the other side, we view the dining room areas as a place where residents can kind of turn themselves around and never have to encounter a dead end condition. Next slide, please. So I'm sure that was a lot to digest in just about 15 or 20 minutes, but I'll just try to recap a little bit, and specifically to highlight some of the specific design measures that we've implemented into this project. Again, in addition to working at an unprecedented pace. So some of the key post-pandemic design enhancements, again, I mentioned the idea that the home areas are clustered, further subdividing the home areas, which create both more intimate and home-like spaces. but also will aid the staff in future outbreak management. There's a very strong separation of clean and soiled service traffic. There are design features to support staff and reduce transmissions. As I mentioned, things like those the locker room function. We are exceeding the Ministry of Long-Term Care's minimum design standards for many space allocations. The spaces are larger than they need to be. So, for example, the residence bedrooms are about 10 or 15% larger than the Ministry of Long-Term Care's minimum standard. And corridors are typically 7 feet at their narrowest, which is again exceeding the ministry's minimums. And we've also, I mentioned the family visiting and family caregiver access during a pandemic that we've given some thought into how that process will work. There's also a very generous ground floor resident common amenity spaces. I mentioned the town hall, chapel space, the ground floor resident courtyard, the gift shop, and the gathering lounge. All of that space that will really create a social hub or heart for the entire 320-bed home. I mentioned the generous resident rooms, as well as that so many of them are fully private, and even the shared rooms are semi-private in nature, and that all the rooms are going to be equipped to have ceiling lifts, which is another great innovation, and that's another real benefit for the staff. It not only keeps residents safe, but it's a great way to mitigate staff workplace injuries. There's also the dedicated behavioral unit with its secured courtyard, as well as a high acuity unit for residents with higher acuity needs, and there's a specialized memory care unit as well. And finally, on-site dialysis, which again is adds dialysis capacity to the local health network, but also provides dialysis for ambulatory residents right on site, which will be a great convenience for residents. Next slide. There are a number of mechanical and electrical features as well. When we say mechanical systems, we're talking about things like ventilation, air conditioning, and heating. So the building has a very high performance healthcare grade HVAC system, a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system that will provide 100% outdoor air, and it will also provide humidification control. There'll be improved resident comfort through both increased air change rates as well as good temperature control, and that means maintaining temperatures to a comfortable range. Air conditioning is the word that a lot of people look for, but air conditioning actually describes all the work that heating equipment uses. But what we're actually talking about is resident temperature control. So the temperature will be maintained in all resident areas at a comfortable temperature. That was very front of mind for many people after the hot summer we had, and people became increasingly aware that older long-term care homes don't have a challenge in maintaining comfortable resident temperature control. And then also the building is going to be very energy efficient with a number of energy efficient measures, including condensing boilers and ventilation heat recovery. Next slide. In terms of electrical enhancements, there's quite a high degree of resiliency in the project. So that means that 100% of the long-term care power will be on backup power for 24 hours if there was an event where the generator needed to be working. And again, there's a lot of energy efficient measures such as LED lighting and occupancy sensors. And the building is also going to be very future ready. With a lot of network capacity to support changes in technology in the future. And next slide, that might possibly be my last slide. Oh, of course, the outside views, good. We're just going to share a few views of the outside of the building to give you a sense of what it is going to look like. A lot of the materials and the design of the building had to make sure that it was always supporting the rapid construction goals. So there are everything is prefabricated in this project. This is what Andre is going to start getting into. We're working with standardized prefabricated wall panels and structure. And that is one of the reasons why we weren't able to use any brick or masonry. We had to use entirely materials that could be put up very quickly and rapidly and prefabricated. So a lot of the materials on the building are metal sidings. But we're using around the ground floor of the building that kind of brownie color. That's a wood look material. So at the pedestrian realm, it's going to be very warm, very natural looking. And while it's a metal product, which is great, it's non-combustible and very durable, it actually looks quite a lot like wood. It'll be very warm and friendly at that pedestrian scale. And then above the building, we've used lighter tones of metal siding with a kind of persimmon orange accent color for a bit of playfulness. And the intent there is really, from a community sort of perspective, to be really focusing on that pedestrian realm, that first floor with a warm palette and a texture that kind of feels comfortable for pedestrians walking around. And then the lighter tones on the upper building kind of makes the building feel a little less tall, a little less imposing, lightens it up, and kind of helps it blend in with the sky.
Thank you, Matt. It's always a pleasure to hear your passion, and thank you, because we've really benefited from your expertise. Which brings us to our first poll question of the evening. Give it a second to get up on the screen. Do you think we need more long-term care homes in Durham Region? While you're answering, thanks everyone for your participation. We will share the results of the poll a little later on. And now I'd like to introduce you to Andre Boren, Construction Manager at PCL.
Thank you, Mark, for including me in this session. And Matt, great work. G Architects and Parkin have done a phenomenal job putting this project together and explaining in detail the concepts that are being provided. I'm excited to share what our community's skilled tradespeople are doing here. And I'd like to start with our first slide where we talk about our site logistics. Just to give you a sense of where we're at, we have two very large cranes that are going to be on this project. If you've passed by the site right now, you'll see one very large crane located on the north side. The second crane, which will be located on the south side, is about to arrive and get erected. The drawing here shows something like 4, but it's actually, that's the travel path that we kind of plan, and our team plans how these things are going to arrange and lift the pieces. And there's a lot of large, heavy pieces that we have to manage in this rapid construction. If we can go to the next slide. And continue to the next slide so we can start on the kind of journey that we're at. So this is a quick view of where we were in January, although our team had arrived in early December to set up fencing and a few things just to get us ready to come on site. January was really our big start. And this diagram shows some of the key elements that we had to excavate right from the start. And we moved in total just over 1,400 cubic meters of earth in order to get the project going. Next slide. Here's where we are coming in February. We start to do the foundation. So the green highlighted areas within this image shows the foundation work that we started on the west end. The gray areas are the deeper kind of pads that we had to dig, and those pads would include elevators or stairwells. Next slide. And we continue further to the center core, which involves some column pads and further foundation work. And if we continue to the next slide, we go into the latter part of February where we continue foundation work into the east end of the project. And during this period, we've done other works like connect the sewer, sanitary, and prep the site for the services that will come into it. Next slide. And starting in March, we're just finalizing the last little bit of foundations there on the east side. And that's likely showing where we started our pours there. Next slide. And then latter part of March, we began pouring our first slab on grade, represented in the big green blob, represented on the west end. We continue to the next slide. This is where we're at essentially now. That big crane is helping us put in place what is essentially the elevator core, which is made out of precast slab pieces that is erected and assembled in a box form. And then shortly after that, in the next few weeks, we'll start what will show up in the next slide, I believe, is the wall panels. We have approximately 700 wall panels that will make up this building, and they are structural wall panels made out of structural gauge stud and metal, as well as the outer elements will be pre-finished to allow at least the AVB. It won't have the envelope on, but it will start to close in the building very rapidly. The beginning level won't have the windows, but as we get up through the building, we'll be adding windows within these wall panels. And as you can see, we're moving along and pouring the slab at the elevator cores. Next slide. We continue across the building. In the center core, we'll start the assembly of the structure for the center core, which includes columns and beams and out of precast, as well as the slab on grade pour to the east end. Next slide. And at that point, we will drop in place the precast slabs. There's roughly just over 3,000 precast pieces that will make this building as we go along. If you continue to the next slide, please. You'll see that we continue putting up the wall panels onto the east side. And if we continue to the next slide, you'll see a repetitive pattern. Now here's where it changes, because the second floor is really where the resident areas start. And you'll notice a difference in color. Those light blue pieces are washroom pods, which we are building offsite and completing on the inside, ready, more or less finished. And then the outside is left open to allow our skilled people to do their final adjustments, connections, and testing. We continue to the next slide. You'll see we carry on, and it's very much like the floor below where we put in the columns and beams. And we continue through the next slide. You'll see that there's a stair core that we need to kind of put in place in a core wall before we go to the next slide, which will show, oh, it kind of skips, wow, fast. But the wall panels, and then of course, we'll be putting in place the precast. If you continue to the next slide, we'll move this a little bit faster and you'll see it'll jump. Next slide, please. And here again, just a little segment of the wall panels going up and the washroom pods. Next slide. This is now getting into the latter part of June, I believe, where we're topping off the precast slabs there. Continue to the next slide. And probably last week of June, where we're doing the final little bits of wall panels on the east side. Next slide, please. And further wall panels and washroom pods as we continue up the building. And this is happening really fast. Almost on a weekly basis, you'll see this amount of activity. If you go to the next slide, we're almost near the top, and we're doing the last bit of precast on the core there. And if you continue to the next slide, we get into July, where we're topping off almost the second last floor with the precast. Next slide. And now we hit the roof. So sometime in July, and I believe it's the mid part of July, we start the roof on the west side while we put up the last little bits of structural elements on the top floor. Next slide, please. And we continue across, topping off and putting in the mechanical penthouse units and putting in the precast on the east side. Next slide, please. Through August, we continue with the mechanical units on the rooftop. And if we continue through to the next slide, you'll see that we've started the envelope, and this will go very rapidly, where we're kind of wrapping from the west side and going around the building and going up. So there will be crews working pretty much all day. We start fairly early in the morning. I think it's 6, and we'll continue to just before midnight at this pace. Next slide. And you can see how rapidly we go up the building on the west side, and on the east side we continue up. It's a little bit slower because the centerpiece needs a little bit more time. Next slide. And we continue up, and more of the work on the roof and the elevation continues. Next slide. And we can complete the elevation in September, and that's where we start to do the final tie-ins to the roof. Next slide. And we complete the roof. Next slide. At this point, I'm going to switch the conversation because there's landscaping and stuff like that, which will be happening in parallel. But here's a little indication of some of the modular elements that we're doing: precast core slabs, precast cores for the stairs and elevators, washroom pods, and that's the down in the bottom left corner. You can see the washroom pod and how it would look like on the inside. These things will come delivered wrapped, shrunk wrap, essentially like anybody out there that's into boating and you winterize your boat, it would look something like that. Up on the top right is the wall panels, and that's giving an indication of how they're assembled, and then they're tilted up, and the final pieces of the at least the underside of the envelopes put in the AVB, and to a certain degree the clips and windows. And then other notable elements down at the bottom in the center is mechanical risers. So in order to allow this building to proceed very rapidly, our M&E partners are assembling pre-racked or pre-riser elements such as HVAC units or electrical trays, which includes power distribution and comms. Next slide, please. Here's a quick run through of how a pod element might work. And if we move to the next slide, this is pretty much the precast slab and how it would look like just before we raise a wall panel on it. And there's a little hole in the middle there, and that's where the mechanical risers would go. Next slide, please. These are the exterior wall panels. Those would be erected first. And then if we move to the next slide, we drop in the interior structural wall panels. If you move to the next slide, we then put in the tie beams that would put it together. And then right after that, we drop in the washroom pods, not into its final place, but somewhere close inside the rooms. And then in the next slide, we cover it with the precast elements. The next slide will bring us back into the space and start to show what's going on. Next slide. Where we'd introduce wall partitions, so you get a sense of where the room divides. And then the next slide will show us putting in the mechanical risers. And then the next slide will show us putting in the wall partition around the risers. And if you carry through to the next slide, we complete the partitions, cladding them and getting them ready to accept the washroom pods. If you can click to the next slide, you'll see that we set the washroom pod in its final location. And at this point, our skilled people, tradespeople, will do the final connections and get those things tested and running beautifully. If you click to the next slide, this shows us coming in and doing basically a topping, and that's how we get these floors perfectly flat. And we're going to flood the floors before we introduce the next element, which is on the next slide, which is the partition that includes the door. And we're doing this to ensure that we've got the best floor flatness that we can achieve at all points throughout the building, so the residents don't have to worry about slight slopes and challenging flooring. Next slide. And then we finish the wall elements, and in there you can't see it because it's kind of grayed out, but we insert the final doors after that topping's in place. And if you click on to the next slide, which I think is the end, essentially we start the finishing, the real finishing, the painting, the flooring, and that kind of stuff. So I hope you enjoyed that kind of slideshow.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you to the PCL team and all the dedicated trades on site making this a reality. It's greatly appreciated. A few moments ago, we asked you, do you think we need more long-term care homes in Durham Region? 98% of you answered yes, so thank you. We're going to move to a second polling question. So please follow the link and provide your answers, and we'll recap it towards the end of the presentation. Has tonight's virtual open house been helpful to improving your understanding of the project? While we wait and report for an answer of this polling question, some questions have come up on an email on the Lake Ridge Health email address that I'd like to provide some answers to. First question is, why did the planning team go with a modular design? The need for long-term care beds in the region is high, and the province of Ontario committed to expediting the construction of the facility. With the extensive experience of PCL, the use of prefabricated panels and modular components that Andre went through very detailed and very well, it's allowed us to bring the project to completion many months ahead of a more traditional construction project. Another question that came up was, how was the site selected? Lakeridge Health has recently completed its 25-year master plan for the future of acute care needs for the region and all of our sites, including the Ajax Pickering Hospital site. The hospital-related master plan developments assessed for the Ajax Pickering site focused on the northern part of our site. The south part, where the long-term care home is being built, was therefore an ideal opportunity for this important and needed project benefiting the region. We want to thank the Province of Ontario, the Region of Durham, and the Town of Ajax for their collective commitments to enabling the development of this area of the hospital site. So thank you for all who took part in our second polling question. And now for the answer. Happy to report 100% of you responded that this virtual open house has been helpful for your understanding of the project. Please continue to watch for updates on our website, www.lh.ca, for future virtual updates. That's about all the time we have in tonight's virtual open house. Remember, if you wish to go over any part of this presentation, the link will be available on our website. Please be sure to check our Lakeridge Health website for all updates on the accelerated long-term care build project in the future. Tonight's videos and answers to questions provided in advance as well as during this comment section will be posted in the coming days. In closing, I want to thank the team at Lakeridge Health who supported us in putting this event together and our host. Thank you and have a good evening and be safe.